So we're going to talk today about soils and essentially what soil is and what it's made of. Um, so all soils are made predominantly of these four different parts: mineral particles from rocks that are broken down. And so soils obviously contain rocks in various stages of weathering, from things like boulders to tiny pebbles. But really, the only mineral particles that are thought of as being part of the mineral soil are sand, silt, and clay. So those are particles of descending size, and depending on the proportion of the soil that's made up of sand, silt, or clay, it can have a huge effect on various soil properties, like the amount of water the soil can hold, the number of nutrients that are available to plants, and so on. So, in addition to mineral particles, soil contains organic matter in various stages of decomposition. And the amount of organic matter in soil, so things like decomposing leaves and plant parts, dead animals, the amount of organic matter will have a significant effect on how fertile the soil is, and also how much water and how many nutrients the soil can hold. So in addition to that, all soils have air pockets and spaces of different sizes that can either contain air or they contain water with dissolved minerals. So in addition to these four kind of non-living parts of soil, soil always contains and is affected by a host of living things. So fungi, bacteria, photosynthetic prokaryotes like cyanobacteria, single-celled protists or diatoms, and then larger organisms like moles, rodents, insects, mollusks, and above all, predominantly the roots of plants. So the physical properties of soil are described in a number of different ways, and the first way is soil texture. So soil is essentially a mixture of a bunch of particles of varying size, and those particles are categorized as sand, silt, and clay, with sand particles being the largest, silt intermediate, and then clay particles being the smallest sized. So one way that we define soil types is by the proportions of sand, silt, and clay that they contain. So as you'd expect, sandy soils have predominantly sand, 92% in this case. Clay soils have a much larger but relatively moderate proportion of clay. And then in between you have loamy soils, which are kind of more of an even mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Usually loamy soils around here, loam and silt loam, are thought to be the most fertile and the best soils for agriculture. But different soil types categorized in this way have very different properties, and we can make predictions about what the conditions might be like based on soil type. So for example, sandy soils are large particles that drain extremely rapidly. So when rain hits, the soils fill up and then drain quite quickly. Also, in hot and cold climates, sand soils heat up very quickly in the sun and cool down very quickly once the temperatures drop. On the other end of the spectrum are clay soils. Clay soils hold a lot more water and they drain incredibly poorly. What that means is that often after rains, the air pockets in the soil can fill up. Sometimes conditions in the soil can become anoxic because there are no available air spaces in the soil. And you also might get more pooling on the surface of soil and maybe erosion through runoff. Another thing that you might find in clay soils is that they retain things like pesticides a lot more than sandy soils would, where chemicals are much more easily leached out of the soil. So another way that we categorize soils is their water holding capacity. And the amount of water that a soil can hold is a direct function of particle size. So in clay soils, the proportion of the soil that's made up of pockets of air or water is much larger than that proportion in sandy soil. So in clay soils, it can be between 50 and 65% of the soil is made up of air pockets. In sandy soils, it's more like 35 to maybe 50% at most. So just as a result of the physical structure of soils, clay soil can hold a lot more water than sandy soil can. In addition, clay particles often have quite a strong negative electrochemical charge on their surface, and as a result they attract positive ions to their surface. So this includes some of the major plant nutrients and also water molecules. So for these reasons, clay soils hold a lot more water, but they release that water more reluctantly. So water drainage is slower, and often conditions in the soil can become anaerobic. So sandy soils, on the other hand, hold less water, but that water drains much more quickly, and so the soils remain well aerated. So there are predictably different conditions that are produced by soils that are predominantly clay or sand-based. So this slide's a really good description of how water actually travels through soils. So if you can imagine kind of a grassy meadow, for example, and you get a heavy rainstorm that lasts for several hours, and slowly all of the pores within the soil fill up with water. When you get to a point where all of the small and large pore spaces in the soil are saturated, you may even start to get some runoff of water on the surface of the soil. That's saturation point, and that's the point at which the soil is holding its maximal amount of water. Over the next sort of 24 hours, the effects of gravity mainly will kick in, and we'll start to see water draining down through the pores of the soil. So a lot of these larger pore spaces will start to refill with air. But then after about 24 hours, that drainage will slow substantially, and we'll reach a point where, although many of the large air spaces have refilled with air, there's still kind of a continuous film of water covering all of these mineral and organic particles. And what that means is that water can still travel upward through the soil by capillary action, so it can be attracted easily to roots and absorbed and then travel up the plant and even evaporate through transpiration. At this point, the soil is at a stage that we call field capacity. So this is a kind of not an equilibrium point, but a point where drainage slows substantially and we can still have upward and downward movement of water. As plants transpire, though, and some of the smaller air pockets start to fill up with air again, we lose this continuous film of water between particles. And we get to a point where the soil is dry enough where plants can't obtain enough water, and they start to wilt and in some cases die. And this is called the wilting point of the soil. Now, the proportions of minerals and organic solid materials with water and air at this point where plants start to wilt and die is called the wilting coefficient of that soil type. So in this example, we're looking at kind of an average silty loam, but the wilting coefficient will be very different in soils of different types. What you also need to remember, though, is that plants that are native to different soil types respond differently to these conditions. So in other words, some plants, like these cacti, for example, are tougher than others. So what this graph is showing us is that different soil types that we can see on the x-axis here can hold vastly different quantities of water. So the field capacity of a clay soil is much greater than the field capacity of a sandy soil down here. At the same time, though, the permanent wilting point of these soils is very different. So in clay soils, plants start to wilt and die at much higher soil water contents than they do in sandy soils. And this is because of the type of plants that establish and are adapted to these different soil types. So for example, a cactus in sandy soil will only start to wilt or die at very, very low water contents in the soil, whereas plants adapted for clay soils tend to start wilting much earlier than that, when soil moisture levels are still relatively high. So another way that we categorize or define soils is based on their cation exchange capacity. So what this means is nutrients in the soil vary in the degree to which they're available for the plants to take up. So some of those nutrients are kind of attached or absorbed to the surface of soil particles, and those nutrients are not available to plants. But those nutrients can sometimes be released by the particles and dissolved in soil solution, at which point the plants can take them up. As roots remove nutrients from the soil solution, the concentration of those nutrients goes down, and usually the soil particles will then release more nutrients into the solution. So this is cation exchange from the soil particles into the soil solution. Different conditions within the soil can affect cation exchange capacity. So the rate or how readily nutrients are released by soil particles into the soil solution. So in highly acidic soils, for example, nutrients are very readily released from soil particles into the soil solution. What that means is that in acidic soils, nutrients in theory are more readily available for plants to take up. But the other side of it is that those nutrients can also be very easily leached out of the soil and be kind of removed from areas where plants can make use of them. So if you think about a very acidic, sandy soil, in those situations, nutrients are released very quickly into soil solution, but they're also very quickly leached out of the soil in sandy conditions. So what that means is that in sandy soils, plants have to be very quick to absorb the nutrients that they need before they're removed entirely from the soil column. So another way we categorize soil is by looking at soil pH. And as we just mentioned, soil pH is important because it affects the availability of nutrients in the soil for plants. Just to kind of give background about pH generally, the pH of the soil is really determined by the proportion of hydrogen and aluminium ions in the soil compared to other ions. So the more hydrogen ions in particular, the more acidic the soil will be. The pH scale ranges from 1 to 14, 1 being extremely acidic, 14 being extremely alkaline or basic. And soil can range significantly from about kind of 3.5 in acidic soils to maybe 10 in very basic soils. But generally speaking, nutrients are most available to plants at pretty neutral pHs, so around pH 7. But there are exceptions to that. So we talked a little bit before about in mildly acidic soils, what happens is that those hydrogen ions bind to soil particles more firmly than other nutrient ions. And so other nutrients are released into the soil solution and they're more easily taken up by plants. There are other exceptions. So particularly certain nutrients like phosphorus, for example, one of the most important nutrients for plants, is actually easier for plants to take up at slightly basic pHs, so relatively high pHs. So the pH of different soil types can vary significantly. And also the types of vegetation that grow in these soils can be characteristic, but also the vegetation itself can have a strong influence on the pH of the soil. So for example, this is a pine forest in New Jersey with very acidic soils. So the pH of these soils is around maybe 3.5. So quite acidic. These pine trees are well adapted to growing in acidic soils, but also the needles that they drop significantly increase the acidity of the soil. So unlike a kind of temperate deciduous forest where you'd see loads of different kind of species growing in the understory here, in pine flats like this, often you see pretty species poor areas at the base of the trees, and that's because these trees are affecting the pH of the soil to such an extent that very few plant species can actually survive. So on the other end of the pH spectrum, you have these arid grasslands of southwestern US, so Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico maybe. And these have very high pHs, so up to maybe 10, which are very basic conditions. So these grasses are well adapted to alkaline conditions, but also they might be selected in a different way. So, for example, habitats where there's a lot of rainfall, we tend to get acidic soils, and that's because the hydrogen and aluminium ions bind very strongly to the soil particles, and so other ions get leached out the soil, leaving high concentrations of hydrogen and aluminium, and that leads to acidic soils. So in very arid climates, which grasses are also well adapted to, you get very basic soils because you get so little leaching of those other nutrients out of the soil. So far we've categorized soils mainly in terms of the proportions of different size particles, so sand, silt and clay. And when we talk about the proportions of those different size particles, we're talking about soil texture. But another way we can look at soils is to think about soil structure. So those particles get organized into larger units that we call aggregates. And the nature of that aggregation in soil is called soil structure. So just in the way that soil texture can affect things like the drainage and the percolation and aeration of soils, so can soil structure. So elements of soil structure affect what kinds of plants can grow there. And generally the best soil structures for plant growth are the ones that allow free movement of water and air. So another way that we categorize soils, or that we compare soils from different parts of the world, is by looking at soil horizons. And the traditional way to look at that is to dig a soil pit like this one, which might be anything up to kind of 7-8 feet into the ground. And when we smooth off the sides of the pit, we can see these quite clear color changes in the different layers of the soil that we call horizons. So broadly, we think about 4 different horizons. There's the O layer, the A horizon, the B and the C horizon. So the O horizon is organic material in various stages of decomposition. So here you have the O1 layer, which is organic material that can still be recognized for what it is. So maybe it's a leaf litter layer within a forest. Then below that you have the O2 layer, which is organic material that's no longer in recognizable form. So below the O horizon, you have the A horizon, and that's organic material that's been almost completely decomposed, and it often appears in a very dark form in a substance called humus. So humus is a material where plants can get most of their available nutrients from, and it's essentially organic material that's been completely broken down, and it can take very varying lengths of time to be formed. So some organic material is very easy to break down. Other stuff that's maybe, for example, lignified plant tissue like wood might take 2,000 to 3,000 years to break down into the form of humus. So, what that shows us is that when we kind of expose these humus layers of soil and allow them to be maybe eroded by water runoff, it tells us what we're really losing when it might be something that's taken 2,000 to 3,000 years to develop. So below the A horizon, you have the B horizon, which is essentially a layer where we get very, very fine particles that have kind of percolated down the soil layers into what we call the B horizon. And then below the B horizon, you have the C horizon, where there's an area of very limited weathering. So you get kind of much larger particles and small rocks, essentially. And then below that, you have the R horizon, which is the bedrock. So in any given soil type, you won't necessarily see all of these horizons, but the presence and the relative size and the color of these different horizons is very characteristic of soil types from different parts of the world. So soil types vary massively geographically, and a big reason for that is differences in parent material. So the kinds of rocks that soils form from has a big impact on the characteristics of that soil and the kind of plants that can grow there. So just to give a few examples, serpentine soils are produced from rocks that are very high in nickel and cadmium, and they have this kind of almost bluish, greenish tinge. This is a kind of low mountainous area in Northern California. And serpentine soils have very specific plant types that grow there, and usually those plants only grow in serpentine soils, and that's why they're called serpentine endemics. So any endemic species is a species that only grows in one particular place. We have a lot of endemic species here in South Florida, mostly in the pine rockland habitats. So pine rocklands exist on very thin soils, on very calcium heavy substrate. So not very many plants are adapted to grow in this very, very thin soil, in this very kind of limestone rich area. And so the plants that do grow there tend to be endemic. And as you can imagine, if we dig down into this soil here, we don't see many of those horizons that we saw in the previous example. So in the southeast United States, I would say the most common soil type are altisols. And this figure just shows kind of the development of an altisol over time. So originally you have these very small plants growing almost directly on the rock, the unweathered rock. But as those plants grow larger and start dying and decomposing, we see over time the generation of this kind of thicker and thicker weathered layer, and this thicker layer of accumulated organic matter and humus and other kind of much more fertile material. So there's this kind of feedback loop where as the soil depth and fertility increases, it can support larger vegetation. And then as that larger vegetation dies and decomposes, the soil layer continues to get thicker and thicker. Over time, the vegetation develops into a mature forest, and the soil develops into an altisol. So another common soil type in the US are mollisols. So mollisols develop in a very similar way to altisols, except they're in climates that support naturally grass vegetation or prairies. So very slowly the grasses begin growing on almost bare rock, and over time this organic matter accumulates. And in mollisols, those soils and organic matter develops this very blocky structure. And that means that the soils will drain very well and they're very well aerated. So they tend to be very fertile soils. And especially because these grasses are very easily cleared, there's very few of these habitats left in the US because these mollisols are so easy to turn into cultivated land and to be used for agriculture.